All right, so thanks again, everybody, for hopping in and joining us today. Super excited to kick off today's webinar about using machine learning to boost conversion rates. And pretty excited to talk about this topic. Last week, I was actually, oh, the chat is disabled. Let me see if I can address that real quickly before we continue here. Okay, chat should be turned on. Thank you. All right, so yeah, super excited to talk about this topic in particular. I was over at the Pendo user conference in Raleigh last week and got the chance to speak to a bunch of product leaders from some really cool companies. And something that tended to come up a lot in those conversations is that people feel like they have a really good grasp on how they're trending with their KPIs like conversion rate, but something that people really struggle with is understanding the underlying factors that are moving the needle on those KPIs, because it's just not always eminently obvious from just looking at analytics. So we'll be diving in a bit into how LogRocket is helping to solve that problem for our customers. And before we get into that, we can just do a couple quick introductions. My name is Will Berner, and I'll be one of the hosts today. My title is Growth Manager, so I'm working with our growth marketing team. And one of the things that we focus on is conversion rate optimization, both in our product for our user onboarding flows and across our website and some of our marketing properties on the web as well. So something that I've definitely dipped my toes into a fair bit. And I might be a little bit biased, but can't really imagine doing CRO without LogRocket. And we'll see more about that shortly. And we're also here with Nikhil. Nikhil, you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, for sure. Hey everyone, I'm Nikhil. I've been an engineer at LogRocket for around 2.5 years. I'm on the team that we call the data science team, but really our goal is to use any techniques and technology that we need, including data science, to build useful features for our users. We kind of operate as an independent team and collaborate with other teams in the engineering org and across the company.
Great. Thanks, Nikhil. And then just a couple quick housekeeping items so everyone knows what to expect. We are recording the session today, so don't worry about taking notes or anything like that. We'll send around a copy after the webinar. And then in terms of our agenda, we're going to start out by talking about a couple of strategies that product organizations tend to use when they're going about KPI optimization, starting out with kind of more of the old school approach and working towards this idea of a more proactive approach that relies on issue identification and quantification with machine learning. From there, we're going to move into a quick interview with Nikhil, where he's going to explain a little bit about the inner workings of our AI product, Galileo, which is making this possible. And we'll round it out by going over 5 examples of real conversion impacting issues that our customers have identified and fixed with LogRocket's assistance. And before we get in too deep, the presentation is brought to you by LogRocket. So a quick intro on who we are. Our goal is to help software teams build better digital experiences by identifying technical and UX issues using our AI, then quantifying the impact of those issues with analytics, and finally providing session replays to show you exactly what went wrong. So this has been kind of a long time in the works. Originally in 2016, when we started out, we were primarily a session replay tool. And more recently, we moved into these areas of analytics and AI issue detection, which is going to be really important to kind of the proactive KPI optimization strategies that we'll go through later in the presentation. And just so everyone has kind of a vague idea of what these 3 solution buckets mean and what they look like, the idea of issues is basically this idea where LogRocket will monitor user experiences on your web and mobile applications and proactively surface the most impactful issues that users are experiencing on the front end, whether those are network errors, something technical in nature, or more UX-focused things like dead clicks and rage clicks. Analytics, this probably looks familiar to most people who are here to learn about conversion rate. We do offer some standard conversion funnel monitoring. And then finally, sessions is this idea of capturing basically video replays of users interacting with your web or mobile applications, being able to see exactly what they experienced and what might have gone wrong. All right, thanks for sticking with me through that. So we'll start out first with this idea of kind of the old approach is what I'll call this. And I'll caveat that by saying if this is, kind of the approach anyone here is taking, we don't mean that like offensively, and you shouldn't feel bad about this. The technologies we're going to talk about that enable this more proactive approach are all extremely new and still kind of being developed. So it's totally fine if this is what you're doing because it is kind of a proven strategy. But essentially, the way that this would work is you're probably tracking some funnels in an analytics solution, and you might notice that there has been a decline in conversion rate. And you're like, okay, we need to look into this further. Thankfully, a lot of these analytics solutions that track funnels do a pretty good job of showing you which steps your users are having the most issues with and not completing. So you might see, for instance, that you have an issue with users visiting the home page, but not making it to an item description page, for example. And then from there, it's basically on you to come up with ideas for what might be going wrong, to formulate a hypothesis, and then go ahead and test a solution. So this does work at the end of the day, but it is a bit of a guess and check approach. And it's a bit more reactive in nature, where you don't really get the ball rolling until you already have seen a noticeable decline in the KPI that you're looking at. And at that point, there's already going to be some negative impacts that you probably would have wanted to catch a little bit earlier if you could. So there is some room for improvement here, and that brings us to what I'll call the new-ish approach. So this is a little bit more advanced, but still not quite perfect. And the way that this works is it starts off the same. So essentially, you'll be reacting to a noticeable decline in a KPI that you're tracking. In this case, we're talking about conversion rate. And from there, again, you'll identify the step where the drop-off occurs. And then if you're working with a session replay tool, there's a lot of them out there. A lot of them will give you basically those replay experiences of users who completed step 1 but failed to complete step 2. So this can be super helpful. So if we consider this example of a user on the eBay website, what we're seeing here is that someone is clicking this button to buy it now, but unfortunately nothing is happening and it's not proceeding on to the next step. So if you're lucky, you'll be brought into a session that has some kind of an obvious roadblock that the user is running into. And from there, you can hypothesize what you can do to make this experience better. The issue with this is that it's still reactive in nature. And with most direct-to-consumer environments, there's going to be a rather high volume of sessions. So even within this subset of users who made it to step 2 but failed to complete it, you're kind of just seeing if you're getting lucky and happening to look at the right session where there's something obvious that can inform your next step. And that brings us to this idea of the new approach, where actually we're starting off differently than we did with these other approaches. So rather than waiting to see problems manifest as a decline in conversion rate, we're actually starting out by notifying you proactively of new issues that are impacting your users and potentially having a material impact on KPIs like conversion rate. So we'll start by identifying the issue. That's the first step. From there, we use analytics to quantify the impact of that specific issue on your conversion rate. A next step from there could be to watch sessions to confirm that the issue is having the impact that our models suspect that it is indeed having. And then from there, implement a fix and hopefully numbers go up. So not too much has changed here, except the starting point. Rather than waiting for the issue to have an impact big enough for us to notice, we're starting with the issue itself, the root cause, and then moving on to the numerical impact and fixing it from there. So it just kind of flips the script. And let me just make sure I'm not missing any QA. Okay. And I think that's a good segue into our interview with Nikhil, because some of you might be thinking, this sounds great, but it kind of sounds too good to be true. But I promise it's actually not. So I did my best to explain Galileo and how it works, but Nikhil, is someone who, is working on the product, involved in the data science team, would you mind just giving your kind of view of what Galileo is and how it functions?
Yeah, for sure. So at a high level, Galileo consists of our issue severity feature and then also issues digests. So I'll just explain what those are. So issue severity just means that we're assigning basically a numerical value indicating the probability that an issue is like severe, meaning it's impacting the user in a negative way severely. And oftentimes that'll be like in a conversion funnel or something like that. And we also have issues digests where we deliver you the most impactful issues, like to a Slack channel, to your email, things like that. And basically, we've trained a model which we give an instance of an issue to. So that could be like one time when an exception happens on your site, or one time when a network error happens. And the model is able to give us back the probability that the issue is severely impacting the user. And then we can just look at the probability for all the times that same issue occurred in various user sessions. And we can identify those issues where the probability of being severe is consistently very high. And those are the issues that we can deliver directly to you. Those are the issues that we think are the most likely to be impacting your product or your site. And yeah, that's basically what Galileo is.
Awesome. Thanks, Nikhil. And that'll bring us into the next question. And so obviously not all issues are going to look exactly the same. Kind of touched on it briefly that there's different types of issues. So could you just walk us through what the different issue categories are and how they're defined?
Yeah, definitely. So before I get into that, like an issue just means a time in a session when something negative happened. So really, like issues are all connected. Like if there's a 400 response from the network, which then causes your application to throw an exception, which then frustrates the user and makes them like click a bunch of times on a button. Those are three separate issues, but really they're the same underlying problem. So our overarching goal is to identify problems like that and just tell you like users aren't able to do this because of a network error. And one of the steps in that process is identifying those three separate issues, and that's what we have right now, which is we have 6 different types of issues that we identify using our SDK in your site, and then we can report those back to you. So I'll just go through those 6. The first two are kind of obvious. There's JavaScript exceptions or errors and network errors. And so that would be like a network error would just be like anything with an error status code, so like a 400 bad request or a 503 like service unavailable. And then the other issue types that we have are rage clicks and dead clicks. So a rage click is like if someone gets annoyed at your application, they might like mash a button or something. So we can detect that. We detect when someone clicks on the same thing in quick succession in the short number of seconds. We call that a rage click. Um, we also have dead clicks. So this, on the other hand, is when a user clicks something that should be interactive, like a button or a drop-down menu, but nothing the user can see changes, hence dead. And this can often cause a poor experience for the user because they were expecting something to happen. So for example, imagine you like click pay now on an e-commerce site like Amazon or something, and just nothing happens. There's no loading icon or anything. I personally would be hesitant to click again or do anything out of fear of my credit card being charged twice or things like that. So that's the kind of issue that we want to be able to identify with dead clicks. The next one is frustrating network requests. So we've basically come up with a heuristic for determining whether a network request is frustrating the user. Broadly, this is when the network request is taking a long time to respond. So let's say like 10 plus seconds. And if the user clicks or scrolls or does any kind of activity during that time, we hypothesize that they were maybe waiting for something to happen or they saw a loading icon and they just got frustrated. And so we report that to you in the form of a frustrating network request. And to be clear, that doesn't have to be network errors. It could be a successful request that just takes a really long time and frustrates the user. And then finally, we have error states. So this is a little bit different because if you think about it, every application is going to have a different set of states that you would consider it to be an error for. So like some sites might have a 404 page or a failed login page. So what we do is we can set up a set of default error states for you when you set up a LogRocket. And those would be things like I mentioned, like a 404 or failed login, or like a page containing the word oops or sorry. And then the nice thing is you can define your own extra error states on top of those to detect any specific text or element being visible that indicates your specific app is encountering an error. And once you've defined that, we'll detect it with our SDK on your site and just show you all the sessions that encounter what you consider to be an error state. So those are the 6 different types.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And I think that this example here with the buy it now button would probably be a good example of a dead click. Definitely looks like something should be happening there, but nothing
Yeah,
does.
exactly.
That's too bad. All right. And yeah, you mentioned that one of the core features of Galileo is this idea of severity scoring. So if you could just explain how we go about determining the severity of an issue relative to other similar issues.
Yeah, for sure. So as a reminder, we've trained this model by looking at existing issues that we know. And so we can look at these issues and say, okay, this one is actually impacting the user, this one is not. And those, like, we basically trained a model to do binary classification of yes or no, is this issue severe? And then once we have this model, it's kind of simple. So we just look at the average probability assigned by the model for all the times an issue has occurred within whatever time range you're looking at. So if it's occurred like 10 times, we just sum all those up, divide by 10, and then we can rank all your issues by that average score. Um, and then we can take, the top 10, top 20, whatever you're interested in, and send those to you. But the idea is that the aggregated, like, most severe issues are going to be the ones that are impacting your users the most.
Got it. Makes sense. And then, yeah, so I think a big piece of this is being able to identify the issues that actually lead to the most significant amount of user frustration. Do you mind explaining kind of how we identify frustration or what some of the signals are that we track?
Yeah, definitely. And this is like kind of a hard problem to solve because it's hard to know, like just looking at a session of a user doing something, whether they were frustrated. But in working on this for the past like 2 years or so, we've kind of come up with a few heuristics and ideas for how to determine this. And those 2 things that I want to mention are repeated activity by the user and interruption of flow. So just to go into those, so anytime the user does the same action twice, it's possible they were getting frustrated by something. So for example, a rage click is an example of repeated activity just in a really like quick succession. But this could also be things like reloading a page or clicking on something multiple times just in a longer amount of time, or like navigating back and forth between 2 pages repeatedly. All these things indicate that it's more likely that the user is getting frustrated. And the other one I mentioned is interruption of flow. So what I mean by flow is, imagine if you're like filling out a form or going through a checkout flow or any kind of funnel. Usually people do this in a kind of linear fashion. But if we see dense user activity, like a lot of activity, followed by sparse user activity, like very little, that could indicate that something interrupted the user's flow in between those 2 periods of activity. And that something could be something frustrating or problematic. And that's the kind of thing that we want to identify.
Got it. Yeah, sounds like definitely a tricky problem to solve, but it makes a lot of sense looking for those interrupted flows and repeated actions. And then to kind of wrap up the interview here, a lot of folks here are interested in conversion rate and understanding the impact that different issues are having on that metric. Do you mind just explaining how we quantify the impact of an issue on those types of KPIs?
Yeah, definitely. So at a basic level, like we can look at how many users are affected by an issue and how many sessions overall, which might be different if like users are having multiple sessions on your site. But a little more interesting is, like Will was saying before, once we've done the work to identify those issues that are like most likely to be severely impacting your users, all we really need to do is do a bit of math. And so we just look at the conversion rate for all of your sessions, and then we look at the conversion rate for users who run into a specific issue that we've deemed to be severe. And then we can just do the math to figure out like whether the conversion rate is lower and by how much. and then we can show you that. So that's the kind of data that you can see if you use the conversion funnels feature in LogRocket. We'll show like next to an issue, you can hover over it and it'll show like your conversion rate dropped or didn't drop for a specific issue. And this is particularly useful because issues are usually very noisy, where like most of the issues in your error tracking application aren't actually impacting users. And so you might end up, if you don't have Galileo, you might end up just getting distracted by these issues that aren't actually impacting your user. And just by happenstance, the math works out that people who run into an issue are like negatively like correlate with being dropping off of the funnel. And so the thing that's useful about having the issues that we know are severe is we can just focus on those and identify the ones of those that are actually having the impact on your funnel.
Gotcha. Makes perfect sense. And then we actually have a question from the chat that I think fits in pretty well here. How do you deal with things that might look like a rage click on the surface, but might actually be expected behavior? For example, clicking through to the month on a calendar interface.
Yeah, this is something that, you know, is a problem that we're still working on. So like we have shipped this issue severity thing that you can use if you have LogRocket like on the pro plan, but we're constantly working to improve it. And that's the example that this person gave is something that we've run into where like someone clicking the next button on a calendar modal or things like that will get picked up as a rage click. And basically the reason this works well is that we're able to look at like the surrounding activity that the user did. And so if like for example, if they're just in their flow state of like filling out a form or searching for something on a dashboard, and then they like click a bunch of times on the calendar thing and then they continue on their way, that's less likely to be a real issue than if they were in a flow state and then they rage clicked on something and then they stopped doing activity, which would indicate that they like got interrupted. And so that's part of what the model has learned. And obviously it's a machine learning model. Like it's hard to actually look into the inner workings of it because it's a very complicated just like math equation essentially. But that's how we like filter out those ones that aren't legit.
Gotcha. Makes a ton of sense. All right. So I guess with that, we can transition into some of the examples of real issues that we've picked up with this model. By the way, if anyone else has additional questions on those examples or for Nikhil, feel free to drop them in the QA as well, and we'll either stop or come back to them at the end of the presentation. So let's get into it. So I think something that probably everyone here has run into at some point or another is just confusing user experience design. And this can actually take a lot of different forms. There can be things like difficult navigation, where maybe the button you need to click to move to the next step is obscured, or it's not obvious that it's a clickable element that you're supposed to interact with. You can also have things like unclear instructions, where maybe the flow you're trying to complete is relatively complex and requires navigating to different places within the app, but it's not necessarily telling you all the detail you need to know to understand how to complete that flow. And there's also things like unresponsive UI elements, which could lead to something like a dead click that Nikhil talked about earlier, where something appears like it should be a clickable element, but it's actually not. So these are just a few examples. I know I've run into like a cookie banner blocking a button that you need to click to proceed to the next step, and that obviously can get really confusing as well. So these can really be disruptive and also a bit difficult to identify in a lot of cases. The real example of this, and it's funny that somebody mentioned the like calendar interface, because that is super relevant to this example. One of our customers is an international airline, which operates mostly in the Central and South American region. And they were actually going through a fairly significant redesign of their online ticket booking engine, which is pretty high stakes, because if you think of it, airline tickets are not cheap. So you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to optimize that experience and maximize conversions. But they figured that with this new redesign, it would probably be a good time to test out LogRocket Galileo, because they had the foresight that there might be some issues introduced that they weren't necessarily aware of. So what the team realized was that they had issues pretty much right off the bat. And we were able to identify rage click pattern on this calendar booking interface. So it's essentially like the date range selector where you pick your departure and then your arrival date. And sometimes, like what was happening is users were essentially confused as to whether they were selecting the return or the departure date, just due to kind of a weird logic with the way that this element was behaving on the page. And we were able to proactively identify that issue for them and surface it to them, quantify the impact it had on conversion rate, and they were able to go ahead and get that fixed and prioritized very easily. Because thankfully, they don't really have to take our word for it. We link to the sessions where this issue is occurring, and it was very clear to them and to be able to go show their stakeholders that people are having a really hard time with this portion of the app, and it's something that we need to put some time and attention into. All right, so bringing us to the second example, and I think this is something that is actually really well researched and well studied, is the impact of poor performance on conversion rate. And I've seen a lot of different statistics about this out there on the internet. The thing is, most of them tend to focus on one singular metric, which is page load speeds. I've seen that, every 1 second leads to a 5% decline, something like that. But something that's really important to keep in mind is that performance can mean a lot more things than just page load speeds. For example, if we're talking about mobile, there's a completely different set of performance metrics that we need to be tracking. Application startup time is one that's really important. We also have a new set of performance standards from Google that they refer to as lighthouse metrics. And we also have this idea of tracking performance on single page applications, which I think is something that is often overlooked and is really super important. If you think about it, a lot of experiences take place on one page without ever reloading the URL, because you have components that are essentially pop-ups that are showing up on the page. And one example of that is like when you add something to a cart and there's a pop-up on the page asking you, would you like to continue shopping or proceed to checkout? And that actually leads us well into our next example. The customer in this case is a luxury clothing retailer, and they were really putting a lot of emphasis on innovating their e-commerce experience. But something that we were able to identify for them proactively was that they had an issue with the performance of that shopping cart component. And the way that we're able to measure that is through a metric type that LogRocket offers called time between events. So rather than just looking at a raw page load time, you're able to define these super specific performance metrics. So in this example, they're tracking the time between when a user clicks the button add to cart and when this component of the pop-up is fully visible on the page, because that really is the interaction that's most important for that flow and that step in the conversion funnel. So this is something we were able to surface to them. And again, it was easy to show the impact it was having on users through the session replays, and it was able to be fixed rather quickly. All right, and I think this is where it really starts to get a little bit more interesting. Nikhil talked a little bit about network errors and what they mean earlier. And I think a lot of times teams tend to kind of like silo the different issues that are impacting users, because this might seem like super technical in nature. Like some people might be thinking, this seems like an engineering problem and not something I should be worrying about as a product manager, someone focused on conversion rate. But the fact of the matter is that these types of issues do lead to some really unfortunate user experience impacts. And network errors can cause a lot of different behaviors, including things like error messages, broken UI components. I'm sure some of you have seen like the infinite loading wheel on a page where it just sits there forever and nothing happens. These are all very frustrating experiences that will definitely have material impact on conversion rate. And in this case, the customer that experienced this, they're an international hospitality and entertainment provider, think Las Vegas. And essentially what they found was that users were encountering an issue on the hotel booking page where they were unable to add an issue or add a hotel room rather to the cart due to a 404 network error. So this was basically resulting in the users being completely unable to continue that flow and purchase a room for the night. That actually is a really unfortunate outcome because these conversions are actually worth more than they might seem at face value. For this type of like casino, people are not only going to book a room, but they're going to come, they're going to gamble, they're going to buy drinks, they're going to sit at the bars and the restaurants, and it ends up being a really expensive issue for this customer that we were able to surface. All right, JavaScript errors, also technical in nature, but also something that we need to be aware of when we're talking about conversion rate optimization. And Nikhil alluded to this, but it really is challenging to understand which JavaScript errors are important and which ones aren't, because the impact they have on the end user experience can vary quite widely. For example, a lot of people are running like third-party scripts that might throw errors that have no material impact on the end user's experience. Most error reporting tools aren't going to be able to differentiate between that and something that leads to, for example, like a minimal disruption to the end user's experience, or maybe they just need to reload the page and it fixes the problem, but then they're ultimately able to continue. But depending on the error and the severity of it, some might lead to completely broken or unusable experiences, which is obviously really bad if your goal is to get a user to take a conversion action. So an example of this, we work with a customer that offers a consumer ed tech platform. So a lot of like students and instructors are going onto this platform and searching for online courses and educational products for purchase. And there was a JavaScript exception that Galileo was able to identify and mark as high severity that kind of led to an inability of users to use the search function on the product catalog, which obviously is very bad because that means they can't identify the products that they're looking for and then actually check out and purchase them. All right, and then our final example, I think this is really relevant, is the idea of poor mobile support. We actually ran a webinar about mobile analytics a couple of weeks ago, and one of the statistics that really stuck out to me is I think it was something like 65% of worldwide web traffic in 2023 comes from mobile web. So you would think that it's kind of super obvious that we need to be optimizing our web platforms for mobile support, but there are a lot of problems that can pop up that are just difficult to track down and kind of hard to anticipate. Obviously, we probably all seen examples of just websites that just generally aren't optimized for mobile, and the format or layout of the page is just broken on a mobile device. I know I've definitely accidentally been responsible for such instances once or twice in the past. There's also things like a lack of responsivity to the viewport size. So let's say that there's an element you need to interact with that's obscured from the page because the mobile device viewport is a lot smaller than what you might expect. And then also this idea of bandwidth intensivity. If you think about it, depending on region or kind of network type, users might have slower connections on a mobile device if they're out in a rural area where connectivity is poor, or if they have a poor Wi-Fi connection. If your app is clogging up a ton of bandwidth, that can also have a negative impact on the mobile experience. In the customer example here, it's actually an international fast food restaurant chain that sells a lot of hamburgers. And what unfortunately happened in this case was on that final page of the checkout flow, once a user had already basically selected their meal and added all their items to the cart, the final checkout button was obscured from the viewport. It was basically just below what the user was able to see on that screen. And this was another issue that we were able to surface through users rage tapping in frustration on that interface when they're unable to locate that button and then continue to check out and purchase their food. And I think that getting in between a hungry person and their food is definitely a very dangerous thing to do. So I'm glad we were able to catch this one as well. And then I think that actually brings us to the end of the presentation. So would be happy to field any additional questions from the chat. If anyone is curious about the inner workings of the model, Nikhil is happy to comment on that. any questions on these examples, also happy to go through those as well. Let me just find the QA to make sure I'm not missing anything. All right, I think we may have covered everything in that case. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Had a great time going through this. Thanks, Nikhil, for fielding my questions. I think everyone hopefully found it as insightful as I did.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, everybody. Have a great day.